I want to welcome you all to this five-part series, Arguing with God. This series is sponsored by the Grzybinski family in honor of the memory of Dawn Grzybinski, David's sister. We are very grateful to the Grzybinski family for sponsoring this series. Thank you so much.
Welcome, everybody. It's nice to see you all. I am going to begin by by muting everybody just so we can get started. If you have a question, please use the raise hand function. I'll also unmute every now and then to see if there are any questions that you may have as we go through this discussion. I already see again that Jillian has her hand up. So Jillian, do you have a question?
No.
Okay, I'm lowering your hand.
I don't know how.
Lowered your hand. That's another amazing thing that I can do here. You can just lower your hand. Now your hand is up again. Something's malfunctioning, Jillian. I'm going to assume you don't mean to keep doing that. Okay. So let us begin. Welcome to this class, which is called Arguing with God, five-part series. Today, we are going to do some introductory work about the topic in general of arguing with God, as well as dive into the first subject of arguing with God, which is Adam and God. So I have a presentation which I'll share on the screen, and then we'll be able to study it together. So hopefully everyone sees on their screen where it says Arguing with God with a nice cloudscape. Everyone see that? Yes? Okay, great. So what I'd like to do right now is I want to start with a video clip. This is a video clip from one of my favorite television shows called The West Wing. The West Wing is a show that depicts what happens in the White House during 8 years of the administration of Jed Bartlett. And there's a famous, perhaps the most famous episode in this show is called Two Cathedrals. And in this scene, President Bartlett is in the National Cathedral in Washington, D.C., after his longtime secretary, Mrs. Landingham. Now, this is the first opportunity for you guys to get extra credit. I'm going to unmute you. Who knows Mrs. Landingham's? Question is, who knows Mrs. Landingham's first name? Okay, I'm unmuting you. Anybody?
Mrs.
Anybody? Anybody know her first name? Oh boy, this is disappointing.
Usher.
Dolores. All right, now you know. Dolores Landingham of blessed memory. Okay, so she dies in a car crash, and President Bartlett is very upset. And it's also very important to know that President Bartlett is a devout Catholic. Again, for extra credit, what college did President Bartlett go to?
Notre Dame.
Excellent, Carol.
University.
Notre Dame. He went to Notre
Yes.
Dame. Excellent.
Yes.
Okay, now you're back in good graces. Okay, no pun intended. Okay, so he's in the cathedral. The service is over, and before he goes back to the office, this is what ensues in the episode. I'm just going to make sure that the audio is shared properly. Share computer sound. And here we go. Thumbs up that you can hear this.
It was a beautiful service, I thought. I thought it was a beautiful service. Yeah. She was a real dame, old friend. A real broad. Yeah. We've got to go back to the office now, sir. Yeah. We've got some decisions to make now. Leo, would you do me a favor? Yeah. Would you ask the agents to seal the cathedral for a minute? Yeah.
Did you hear?
You're a son of a bitch, you know that? She bought her first new car and you hit her with a drunk driver. What? Was that supposed to be funny? You can't conceive, nor can I, of the appalling strangeness of the mercy of God, says Graham Greene. I don't know whose ass he was kissing there, because I think you're just vindictive. What was Josh Lyman? A warning shot? That was my son. What did I ever do to yours but praise his glory and praise his name? There's a tropical storm that's gaining speed and power. They say we haven't had a storm this bad since you took out that tender ship of mine in the North Atlantic last year. 68 crew. You know what a tender ship does? Fixes the other ships. Doesn't even carry guns, just goes around, fixes the other ships, and delivers the mail. That's all it can do. Gracias, Tibiago Domine. Yes, I lied. It was a sin. I've committed many sins.
Sorry.
Doesn't even carry guns, just goes around, fixes the other ships, and delivers the mail. That's all it can do. Gracias, Tibiago Domine. Yes, I lied. It was a sin. I've committed many sins. Have I displeased you, you feckless thug? 3.8 million new jobs, that wasn't good. Bailed out Mexico, increased foreign trade, 30 million new acres of land for conservation, put Mendoza on the bench. We're not fighting a war. I've raised 3 children. That's not enough to buy me out of the doghouse? Hey, Kratom, Adeo Pio, Adeo Justo, Adeo Shito, Cruciatos in crucem, tuis in terra servos nuntias fui, officium perfecce, Cruciatos in crucem, eas in crucem. You get Heinz.
The ER.
Okay, so that was a very powerful scene. And what's very interesting, here you have the on the screen some of his very, very harsh words. Can you hear me? Some of President Bartlett's very, very harsh words. Just for context, Josh Lyman, when he says about Josh Lyman, he had been shot in an attempted assassination of the president. And so you could see that President Bartlett argues with God, questions God, blames God, and essentially in this, it seems like rejects God in this scene. What's interesting about this scene is who wrote it and the context of the show. So this is from the introduction. This next text is from an introduction to a book called Pious Irreverence, Confronting God in Rabbinic Judaism by Dov Weiss. I have my copy right here. It's a fantastic book. And in the introduction, he uses this scene from The West Wing to set the scene for what he's going to talk about. And he says something really fascinating. Described as one of the best episodes in the history of American television, The finale of the second season of The West Wing revolves around the tragic and untimely death of Mrs. Landingham, Dolores, for those of us who knew her well, the personal secretary of President Bartlett. After the funeral, the president emptied the church of his security personnel and, approaching the altar, angrily rebukes God. This unexpected and irreverent diatribe from America's most beloved fictional president stunned West Wing viewers. How could the hit TV show portray a highly ethical and faithful Christian castigating God in such a brazen fashion? And now here's the key. Noting that the episode's writer, Aaron Sorkin, is Jewish, one TV analyst offered this explanation. Sure, the scene was in church and the actor and characters were both Catholic, and the final words were in Latin, but it was a uniquely Jewish religious experience. This may have been the most Jewish scene ever written, mostly in English. So that is just an amazing insight that the trappings of this scene are Christian, but the kishkas of it, right, the content of it, this notion of arguing with God is very, very Jewish, right? And so this TV critic is able to uncover that by noting that the writer is Jewish, and he's suggesting that the writer is reaching into his own tradition of understanding that Jews have been arguing with God forever, that he writes this scene, suggesting perhaps that had there been a Christian writer, this scene would never have existed, because that's not the way Christians do religion. It's the way Jews do, but not the way Christians do. So that sort of sets the scene for what we're going to talk about, this very, very Jewish idea that we argue with God, and that the Bible is full of examples of arguing with God, as is the rabbinic literature. We're not going to get into that much rabbinic literature over the course of this course. I shouldn't say that. We're going to see some. But this notion of arguing with God is a very, very Jewish idea. Okay. So what's really interesting, before we get to Adam, I just want to sort of, again, continue to set the scene and make some introductory remarks. What's interesting, if we look, for example, and we're going to talk about Moshe in one of the later courses, but I thought this was an interesting point for us, just as we try to get into the mindset, right? Moshe's first interaction with God is a confrontation, right? We would have thought that when the Torah is trying to set the scene in the relationship, trying to set up the relationship between Moshe and God, we may have expected the Torah to set it up in a different way, right? When the Torah sets up the relationship with God and Abraham, it's God commanding Abraham, and what does Abraham do? Exactly what God tells him to. Lech lecha me'artzecha, God tells him to leave, and he leaves. It's true that later he argues with God when it comes to Sodom, but when the Torah tries to just sort of formulate and sort of, we would go back in history, when we first met, what was it like when we first met? What was it like when Avraham and God first met? It was bliss. God said something and Avraham did it. Not so with Moshe, right? Who is the central, maybe the central figure in all of the Torah, right? So in his book, Redeeming Relevance on Sefer Shemot, Rabbi Francis Nataf says, on some level, Moshe's first dialogue with God sets the tone, not only for Moshe's religious life, but for the Jewish tradition as a whole. Again, this idea that it permeates our religion. With this in mind, we might have expected the scene at the burning bush to be full of religious consecration and bliss. Instead, we are confronted with discord and disagreement. God says, go. Moshe says, I can't. I'm not up to it. Send someone else, right? As opposed to what God says, as opposed to the way Avraham reacts, Moshe says, I'm not the right guy. He certainly doesn't agree right away to go. Instead, we are confronted with discord and disagreement, as the striking main feature of the story here is Moshe's arguing with God. What an interesting point, right? To think about how Moshe and God and Moshe's relationship starts. Okay. So let's now jump into the question of, hold on one second, the question of Adam and God, right? That's the main topic of our discussion today. Adam and God. And we're going to talk about the scene in Gan Eden after, actually, I'm going to stop here for a second. I'll unmute. This is a good place to stop and see if there are any questions. Anyone want to use the raise hand function first? Anybody have any comments they want to say by raising hand? Okay, I'll unmute everybody. Anybody have any questions or comments so far?
Where's the raised hand?
Use the raised hand. Do you know how to
You can
raise?
just raise your hand like this, Dove. Do you have a comment?
Raise yours. You need to get his attention. No, you press a button.
Anybody?
Hello, Rabbi, can you hear me?
Yes, go ahead, Lou.
Oh, okay, just a point of information. In the Jewish religion, it is not a sin to lie. The best example is God lies when Moses is recovering from a circumcision.
Well, I'll correct you, Lou. It's not always a sin to lie.
True. Okay. Exactly. But a sin is not an
Friendly
a lie
amendment.
is not an automatic sin.
Right?
Okay.
Okay. Anybody else comment or question about what we've said so far? Okay, great. Let's continue and now jump into the text that we are going to look at. Okay. So the text is from Genesis chapter 1, pasuk 27. Actually, this is not the argument text. This is an important text that sets the scene for what gives a person the right to talk to God at all. Forget about arguing with God, right? What gives us the right to talk to God at all, right? What gives us the right to pray? What gives us the right to praise? What gives us the right to ask, right? Who are we? Right? Ma'anu, right? Ma chayenu. What is our life compared to God? So many Jewish thinkers point to this verse and the idea in this verse, which is that each and every one of us were created b'tselem Elokim, in the image of God. Vayivra Elohim et ha'adam b'tsalmo b'tselem Elohim bara oto. Zachar u'nekeva bara otam. And God created man in his image. In the image of God, he created him. Male and female, he created them. This pasuk gives us dignity and gives us a sense of greatness that allows us even to stand before God. And this is how the pasuk is understood by Yuval Shurlo. Yuval Shurlo is a contemporary rabbi living in Israel, the Rosh Yeshiva of Yeshivat Hesder. And actually, I just saw an article about him today. He's an ethicist, and over the course of the COVID and the Corona crisis, he has become very, very busy with dealing with ethical questions related to the shutdown and life-saving issues. And he has this wonderful book called Image of God. I only recommend books that I have myself read and have. In his image, the image of God and man. And he says as follows: the designation of man as one created in God's image, right, which is the pasuk that we saw a moment ago, grants him the ability to conduct a dialogue with the divine. However, as God's image has two sides, the conquering and the retreating, which were early chapters in his book. Sometimes God is powerful and sometimes God gives us more space. And as man is of few days and full of trouble, the two participants of the dialogue are not equal. That's also important to remember. As willing as God is to listen to our arguments, we should have to remember that there is a power imbalance here for sure. The disparity between the absolute infinite and finite man is a formative and perpetual experience in the human world. Nonetheless, one of man's components is God's image. Thus, throughout Scripture, we see man standing before God, participating in dialogue with him. That's the license to do that. Is we are the closest thing to God besides God himself. Right? That's what it means to be created in the image of God. By the way, this includes angels, because angels don't have choice. And earlier in the book, and other writers also note that the idea behind the image of God is God has ultimate free will, could literally do whatever he wants, and we have free will minus. Right? We have ultimate free will minus. Right? We can't fly, even if we want to, but we can make all the moral choices on our own, which makes us more like God than angels, because angels can't make moral choices. And so Rav Shurlo continues, the dialogue between man and God has many dimensions. There is much pleading and entreaty, which underscores the fact that God remains the eternal leader, determining the fate of mankind. The dialogue focuses to a great extent on man's distress and on his recognition that he cannot solve the entire world's problems. That's what we call prayer, right? When we pray, we are admitting that we are in distress and we can't solve the world's problems. Rabbi Soloveitchik called this the recognition of our neediness, right? That the human being is needy, and the human being is almost always in crisis, because there's always something that's lacking. So part of our dialogue with God is a full recognition of the power imbalance. But the dialogue also includes man expressing a yearning for redemption and release from servitude. Then he says, however, the very fact that complete dialogue is the fullest sense of the term takes place between man and God in the Torah is extraordinary. Complete dialogue is significant in three ways. Now, we're not going to look at all three, but this is the last one. The greatest wonder of the dialogue that we have with God lies in the third dimension of the dialogue. We almost never find a response by God along the lines of, be silent, for such is my decree, right? Even when biblical characters complain in the Bible, with little exception, we very rarely hear say, God, stop it, I don't want to hear it, right? I don't want to hear it, such is my decree. Where was thou when I laid the foundations of the earth is not the standard response to arguments raised before him. Quite the contrary. The overwhelming majority of God's responses to human arguments contain a direct reference to the words of the disputant, meaning God, after hearing the argument, takes into account the disputant's point of view when answering. If God did not take into account the disputant's point of view, God would simply say, I'm going ahead with my original plan, right? This is what I've decided. But that's not how Rav Shurlo understands. So we'll see that soon. In many cases, God accepts the arguments and changes his original plan to some degree. Obviously, this fact raises a major theological question. Okay, so that sort of sets the stage. We are created in God's image, which gives us free will. One of the benefits and responsibilities of being created in God's image. And we also have the right to stand before God, either in prayer or in another type of dialogue, like the ones we're talking about, where we are not necessarily in agreement with what God says, and we let God know that. Okay, when Rav Shurlo said that rarely do we hear God say, this is my decree, be silent, I want to point out that it is rare, but we should be familiar with some of those places where that does happen, lest we think that, A, it doesn't happen, unless we think that this is, we have to take this seriously, right? As this notion of arguing with God is a serious theological conversation. We shouldn't take it lightly. And so here we see, for example, in the book of Isaiah, Isaiah says, God says, woe unto him that striveth with his maker. Hoi rav et yitzro. As a potsherd with the potsherds of the earth, shall the clay say to him that fashioned it, what makest thou? Or thy work, it has no hands? Woe unto him that says to his father, wherefore begettest thou? Or to a woman, wherefore travelest thou? Meaning, we have to be humble before God. And Dov Weiss actually quotes this pasuk in the introduction to his work. He says, as it would be absurd for the clay to critique its potter, so too would it be absurd for a human to critique his maker. Hence, with the exception of Isaiah, the authors of the Hebrew Bible legitimize individual challenges leveled at God. So this is an outlier, right? We saw, can you hear me?
Yes.
We saw Rav Sherlow suggest that, and Dov Weiss also suggests that this pasuk is an outlier, but it is there. It is there nonetheless. And then, just to give you a sense of one side of the rabbinic world in all of this, Hatzur Tamim Pa'alo. By the way, this is what we say. This first phrase, Hatzur Tamim Pa'alo, is what we say at a funeral. It's called Siduk Hadin. It's a very important part of this conversation. Siduk Hadin is a prayer that we say at a funeral where we justify God's decision. It's interesting. A funeral is not a place to enter into an argument with God. A funeral in our tradition is a place to accept God's decision, Siduk Hadin. And it starts with these words, Hatzur Tamim Palo. The rock, his deeds are perfect. Right? So when you say his deeds are perfect, that seems to be shutting down any possibility for arguing with the divine. And that's what the rabbis here in this midrash say. His actions in regard to all creatures of the world are perfect. One should not murmur against his actions. Ve'ein laharher achar ma'asav. None of them can look at him and say, why should the generation of the flood have been swept away? Why should the people of Migdal Bavel, the Tower of Bavel, have been scattered from one end of the earth to the other? Why should the people of Sodom have been swept away by fire and brimstone? Why should Aaron have assumed the priesthood? Why should David have assumed the kingship? Why should Korach and his followers have been swallowed up by the earth? Right? This is good. This is a lot of Jewish complaining. It's a long list, right? Therefore, the verse goes to say, Ki kol dirachav mishpat. All his ways are just. He sits in judgment on everyone and dispenses to each what is appropriate to him. So this is a major this approach represents amazing faith, right? Absolute faith that everything that God does is right. Some people will understand this to mean in the long run, right? If we be able to look at things in the long run, right now it may be terrible, but in the long run we'll be able to understand why it's good. I'm not so sure if I could wrap my brain around that. But so here we're seeing we have a pasuk in Yeshayahu, we have this midrash, which is representative of many others. And then finally, to bring things to a much more modern context, and a context which perhaps we could relate to more, we have two statements from victims of the Shoah who also say something similar. We start off here, Rabbi Shlomo Zalman Unstorfer. Everyone see the red pointer? Rabbi Shlomo Zalman Unstorfer of Bratislava, a victim of Auschwitz, just months before his death, wrote, all justice is with God, and there is no injustice to the just and the righteous. And that is hard to say from Auschwitz, right? That there's no such thing as injustice to the just. I don't know what that means in the context of all the people there, but this is what he writes. Lord of the universe, heaven forbid that we should question your attributes and the justice of your judgments. We also need to conduct ourselves like children toward him and not question his ways. Heaven forbid, for justice is with him. Righteous are you, O Lord, and upright are your judgments. This is sometimes what's called emunah pshuta, simple, straightforward faith with nothing fancy. We're like children, just like a child. This only lasts for a little while, as we all know, but a child up to a point trusts their parents 100%. Whatever their parent says, they believe is the absolute right thing to do, and they're going to do it. And that's the way Rav Shlomo Zalman Unstorfer said we should be vis-a-vis God. There's no room for arguing with God. And finally, one more statement. The statement of Rav Shlomo Zalman Ehrenreich of Romania, also a victim of Nazi brutality. The reckless among us will open their mouths, asking questions and doubting God. Why did God do this to pious and good Jews? However, each person should be very careful not to speak or to think, heaven forbid, against the Holy One. Though we do not understand, the Holy One knows. Justice is with him, and he knows how he needs to behave. So I bring you these few sources, these two sources from the Shoah, the one rabbinic source, the source from Isaiah, and the source from Eov, to note that there is this other approach, right? Which is we're not supposed to question God. We don't understand God. As God said to Eov, "Where were you when I laid the foundations of the earth?" Meaning, you're just a pisher. What do you know, right? You don't know anything. I'm God. You're just zero, and don't try to question who I am. Everything that God does is perfect. Okay, so there's another good time to sort of stop and take a break to see if anyone has a comment or a question. I don't see any hands up. I see Dove's hand up in the screen. Okay, Dove, go ahead.
You know, there's another approach here which I've heard. It's a little nasty. It says, for instance, from the Shoah, we learned something. The Jewish people determined we can no longer be without political power. We've got to have political power, got to have our own army. So even though God's ways may be harsh, that when he does harsh things to us, maybe there's something we ought to learn. I can't remember where I read that. It didn't appeal to me too much. That's
very Soloveitchikian. Let me mute you. That's very Rav Soloveitchik. Rav Soloveitchik was of the approach that we do not understand God. We can't understand why bad things happen. We don't try to attach any particular, let's say, punishment to an event. But when something bad happens, we have to use it to sort of as a catalyst to introspection, or as a catalyst, as you said, to learn something. Not necessarily that we did anything wrong, but why waste a good massacre, right? Well, right? Something bad happens. Even like the situation we're in, right? And thank God we're healthy and we have roofs over our heads and enough food. Although many of us probably know people who didn't fare so well. But I'm sure, and for me it's the case, it's caused us to really think about life in a different way than we've ever thought about it before. That I think, Dove, that's perhaps what you're getting at. That we don't like it, we don't argue about it, we don't understand it, yet we're going to use it as an opportunity for growth. Okay, I see a couple more hands up. I see my mom. Okay, go ahead.
I don't think it's so much arguing as questioning. You can't argue with somebody who doesn't argue back with you. I think even the President Bartlett was questioning God, why he did it, not arguing with him. I think that's
okay. That's true, but you will see in the biblical,
not arguing.
Well, you'll see in the biblical context, God does respond. Right? It is often a dialogue. So that is more of a back and forth.
It's still a question and answer. It's not an argument.
So I think that's semantics, because when Abraham says to God, you can't destroy Sodom, he's not just asking him a question, he's having an ethical disagreement with him.
I think, but nowadays,
maybe semantics.
I think nowadays it's questioning. It's not arguing. Okay.
Yossi.
Yeah. I just want a little pushback. What Dov said. I mean, it's a little bit too expensive of a class lesson to lose 1/3 of your nation, so you will learn that you need a political power. So, I mean, that's a very bedochak. It's kind of okay. I don't have any other reason, so I'm saying God is trying to teach me something. I mean, that's an Ivy League tuition, kind of. So.
Yeah, that's a great point, Yossi. So I would say I agree with you, and just leave us with something else to think about with that question. I would say that I know that Rabbi Soloveitchik was not saying the reason why bad things happen is so that we'll reconsider our life. That's what we should do nonetheless. The sense is that, of course, we would all have rather it not happened, regardless of what may have been the outcome, the positive outcome. But we shouldn't waste it. So it's not suggesting that God did it for a specific reason. I'll save it for later. But I think that's, I'm not sure if that directly relates to the point that you said, Yossi, but I don't think Dov was saying, and my interpretation of Dov was not suggesting that God brings those things so we'll learn. We should learn from bad things, even though we have no idea why they happen. And I will even argue, even if God did them, right? I think there's room within the Jewish tradition to say that things sometimes just happen and God didn't actually do them. And I think that's another important point here. Okay, now let's get into any other questions? Okay, Carol?
The thing that's interesting is both of the Holocaust things that you quoted say that, you know, we shouldn't question God's judgment, but that's actually what we're talking about happens biblically, is we do question his judgment.
Yes.
A lot. So it's just interesting that that's what they posit.
So I think the easy answer is, you know, Avraham is Avraham, who am I? Right. This sort of Yuridat Hadorot, the diminishing of the generations, right. That happens. But you're right. Others would say, no, what's wrong with the biblical model? And not only the biblical model, there's rabbinic models too. So yeah. Okay, we'll take one last comment from Andrea.
Oh, okay. Thank you. You can hear me?
Yes.
Okay. I was having trouble reconciling this page and a couple of other ones that you mentioned about not questioning, but accepting it. And the fact that we're supposed to be able to have a dialogue. We're supposed to be able to directly communicate with God. And so if communicating isn't just a thank you, it could be anything. It could be, why is this happening? I don't understand your judgment. You know, help me out. Or I think it's been very unfair, or whatever it may be. Moshe argues with him about being able to lead the Israelites because he says they won't listen to me. And Avram with, you know, what you said, Saddam. So there are other examples. So I can't reconcile what's being said here with some of the history that we have been taught.
Good. That means the class is doing its job. It's making you think. Good. Yeah, maybe it's not reconcilable. Maybe the Shoah was just so overwhelming that there were two approaches. One is, I'm going to just accept this and I'm not going to argue, and the other is, God is dead. And maybe those are the two approaches and that came out of it. And because it was just, the Shoah was unlike anything that ever happened in Jewish history before, including the Churban Habayit, including the pogroms, including the Crusades. Maybe you're right. Maybe in this case, people they're just left mute. They just can't say anything. It could be it's unrecognizable. Okay, I said the last question, but I see another hand. Is there another hand up? Steve Finkelman, this is literally the last question, and I'm using literally the way it originally meant. Literally. Last question before we go on. Go ahead, Steve.
Okay, you can hear me?
Yes.
So I'm wondering if there's a distinction between God telling a plan, here's what I want to do, and giving man an opportunity to counter him versus something he's already done, like Shoah. It's happened. It's a difference in questioning what happened versus what he's intending to do.
Okay, that's a good point. Tonight's example is actually going to be arguing about what happened, what's going to happen. You're right. So that's an interesting question. Can we distinguish between things that have happened and things that are going to happen? That's a fascinating distinction. I don't know. We'll have to think about that as we go on to see what the evidence bears out. That's a great point, Steve. Okay. All right. moving on. Question to sort of set us up is what initiates the first dialogue recorded in the world? The first dialogue recorded in the world is a dialogue between God and Adam. And what initiates that dialogue? What initiates that dialogue is misbehavior, right? God tells Adam and Eve one thing, and they do something else, right? Like I said before, the first dialogue with Moshe is a dialogue of strife and argument, and the first dialogue in the world that's recorded in our tradition, right, is based on Adam and Eve's failure to follow what God said. So we're here in Bereshit, chapter 3. God tells them not to eat from the tree. Vatera ha'isha ki tov ha'etz l'ma'achal v'chi ta'avahu le'inayim. Right? Eve sees, the woman sees that the tree is good for eating and delightful to eyes. So she eats it. She took of its fruit and ate. And then Vatiten gamli isha ima vayochal. She also gave it to her husband and he ate. Okay, we know the story. And then they realize that they're naked. And then God comes along and says, "Vayishmu et kol Hashem Elohim mitalech began l'ruach hayom v'yitchabei ha'adam v'ishto mifnei Adonai Elohim b'toch eitz hagan." They heard the sound of the Lord God moving about in the garden at the breezy time of the day. I don't know what that means. There are no breezy times here anymore, but I guess that means something. At the breezy time of the day. And what happens? Vayitchabei ha'adam v'ishto mifnei Adonai Elohim b'toch eitz hagan. And they are in fear of God, and they hid from God among the trees of the garden. Vayikra Adonai Elohim el ha'adam vayomer lo ayeka. God calls out to Adam and says, "Where are you?" So that is the first dialogue. God says, "Where are you?" Based on this this act of breaking the rules that Adam and Eve engage in. Okay, so who does God blame for this sin of eating from the tree? Anyone know the answer? I'm going to unmute. Who does God blame for this sin?
Nachash.
Adam.
All of them.
Adam. Okay. How do you know that?
No, woman is no good. Because he asked him where he was hiding, because he assumed it was him.
Right. He addresses himself. To Adam in the previous slide. Vayikra Adonai Elohim el ha'adam vayomer lo ayeka. Right. There's two people here. We know there's the woman and the man, and he calls out to him and says, "Where are you?" And then this is Adam's response. Vayomer et kolcha shamati began v'ira ki eiro manochi ve'echabe. I heard you, but I was afraid because I was naked. I'm not exactly sure what that means, but that's not for tonight. Vayomer migi lecha ki eiro mata. Hamin ha'etz asher siviticha levilti achal mimenu achalta. How do you know that you're naked? Did you eat from the tree I told you not to eat? Vayomer Adam ha'isha asher natata imadi. He natnali min ha'etz v'ochel. This is, we are going to focus till the end of the class on that one verse. Verse number 12, bottom of the slide. Adam says, "The woman you put by my side, she gave me of the tree and I ate." Okay? This is Adam's argument, right? God says, "Did you eat from the tree?" And he says, "What are you getting upset with me for? The woman you put by my side, she gave me the tree and ate." Okay, so instead of saying, "Oh yes, my master, I'm sorry, I ate from the tree," he doesn't do that. He immediately starts to defend himself. We have to unpack what this defense is. I see a question. I thought I saw a question. I thought I saw Yassi's hand up. Yeah, okay. Go ahead, Yassi.
One comment, not a question. God is not blaming anybody until Adam is saying to him that he knows that he is naked. when he walks around, if you look at the text, when he walks around in the garden and he asks, where are you, Adam? He's not asking him, why did you do so and so? He's asking him, where are you? And then he says, Adam says, I heard you and I was hiding because I know that I'm naked. And then God asks, how do you know you're naked? Did you eat from the tree that you were not supposed to eat from? That just...
Yeah. Why is that significant, do you think?
Because when they heard God walking, they didn't know what God knows or doesn't know. They realized that God knows everything from the dialogue and the question that evolves when they start talking.
Right. That's a great, That's beautiful, meaning they had no Rebbe to teach them what God knows and doesn't know. They had to figure it out for themselves.
They don't know what sin is, and they don't know what punishment is, and they don't know what death is. And
although they do know,
what God
know that someone told them, at least Chava knew that someone told her not to eat from the tree.
Yeah, but she didn't know what it means. Okay, I don't want to waste too much time, but the relationship between Adam and Chava and God, we cannot assume that our relationship today are the same as it's described in the text that we're reading here. There's some evolution because Adam couldn't know what we know today. So he couldn't know.
Right. Absolutely. Agreed. Okay. I see another question. I'll take Herb's question and then we'll go on.
There an issue.
Okay,
was there an issue for Chava to eat from the Eitz Hadas?
Was there a what?
An Isur on Chava to eat from the Eitz Hadas.
It certainly sounds that way.
But the psukim don't read that way.
Well, we skipped some psukim. I didn't bring you all the psukim.
No, I know. What it says is, right before it says, Vayitzav Hashem Elokim al ha'adam lemor. We call Eitz Hagan.
You mean to Chava? Maybe not. Okay, it could, maybe not. But nonetheless, so God turns to Adam and says, did you eat from the tree? Right? He was certainly told not to eat from the tree. And then this is his argument on the bottom again, right? His argument that the woman that you put by my side, she gave me the tree and I ate it. So the question is, who is Adam blaming for his sin of eating from the tree? Irv, you have another comment?
Well, it was just the only thing being that may be the reason that God addresses Adam.
Okay, let's assume that that's true, because we could still move on with our question of Adam does not accept responsibility. He does not accept the implicit point that God is making, which is you did something wrong. So who does Adam blame? Carol?
God.
God.
He's saying, you gave me this woman, and that's why I ate it.
You gave me this woman. So that's great. What does Adam assume about the woman then, based on the fact that God gave her to him? That what?
Well, a couple of things. He could be saying, like, you gave me this faulty being, like it's your gift was a problem.
Okay. Right. There's a problem. This is your fault, God. You gave me this woman.
It sounds like your 4-year-old,
Because you gave her to me, what do I assume?
That everything she does is good.
That she's good, because, right, you gave her to me. I'm assuming that she's good because she gave it to me. And she told me to eat from this. This is your fault. Right? This is the first dialogue recorded in the world, is a dialogue of a person not only not taking personal responsibility, but blaming God.
Yeah.
Okay? So that's one option. Okay. And we're going to see some commentaries about this. There is another way to read the pasuk, which is not as inflammatory, and that is that Adam is blaming Chava. Now, you gave me her, she told me to eat. It's not, without making that second move of, you gave her to me, she must be good, I listened to her, therefore it's your fault. We could make the argument that this is Chava's fault. But I want to, for the purposes of this discussion, right, I want to look at this other idea that God said, and we see here the Or HaChaim, commentary on the Torah, says as follows. Let me get my pointer going. Apparently, Adam did not know exactly what happened, except that Eve had placed something before him and he had eaten without examining it. He had not felt the need to ask her what it was she placed before him, seeing that the whole earth was his to enjoy. He added, which you put with me in justification for not having inquired where the fruit had come from. It was as he had said to God, that since God had supplied the woman, like you said, Carol, since God had supplied the woman, he, Adam, had no reason to be suspicious about her motives. After all, nothing evil originates in heaven. Our sages have said, Ein bot kim min hamizbeach ulamala. Once something, a slaughtered animal, has arrived on the altar, having passed several stages of inspection on the way, there is no need to again check its suitability as a sacrifice. Adam argued that if the chazakah, the presumption of fitness of such an animal is acceptable, then surely a woman supplied by God himself need not be examined for blemishes. This is on you, God. This is not my fault, right? This is, so God seems to tell Adam they did something wrong, and Adam argues back and says, hold on a second, let's really get down to the understanding of who did this, whose fault this is your fault. This is, by the way, reminiscent of some other Gemarot. Before we get to that, this is we'll see a Gemara in Avodah Zarah, and which also unpacks this discussion. The Gemara explains that Moshe called the Jewish people ingrates, as it is written that the Jewish people spoke disparagingly of the manna, and our soul loathes this light bread, despite the fact that it was the highest quality food. Moshe further called them children of ingrates, as it is written that after sinning and eating from the tree of knowledge, Adam said, the woman who you gave to be with me, she gave me of the tree and I did eat. Adam complained that the woman who had been given to him in order to cause him to sin, whereas in fact she had been given him to serve as a helpmeet. So not only, now this Gemara takes it a step further. Adam is not only saying, it's your fault, God, because you gave her to me and I assumed everything she did was right. The Gemara seems to be saying, that's why you gave her to me. You gave her to me to test me. Adam complained that the woman had been given to him in order to cause him to sin. You gave her to me. That's commentary. That's not the direct translation of the Gemara. But that, talk about blasphemy. It's one thing to say, God gave me this person and I trusted this person and everyone meant well, but she messed up. But here, it's different. Here, it's Adam saying, you purposely put a stumbling block. You purposely put a stumbling block before me. Okay. This idea now is reminiscent of this Gemara in Masechet Brachot. What is the meaning of Dizahav? When the Gemara talks about the different places that they traveled, the sages of the school of Rabbi Yanai said that Moshe said the following before the Holy One, blessed be he, to atone for the sin after the sin of the golden calf, Master of the universe, because of the gold and silver that you lavished upon Israel during the exodus from Egypt until they said, enough, die. It was this wealth that caused Israel to make the golden calf. Okay? So God takes the Jewish people out of Mitzrayim. That's fantastic. God gives them riches. That's fantastic. Everything's great. Then they build the golden calf. And Moshe, in an attempt to defend Bnei Yisrael, says to God, and maybe he's learning this from his great-great-great-great-great-great-great-grandfather Adam, says, hey, don't blame Bnei Yisrael. This is your fault, God. You gave them the money. You spoiled them, right? This is a parenting Gemara, right? You spoiled Bnei Yisrael. And the Gemara goes on to say, the Gemara offers another analogy. Rabbi Chia bar Abba said that Rabbi Yochanan said, this is comparable to a person who had a son. He bathed him and anointed him with oil, fed him and gave him drink, and hung a purse of money around his neck. Then he brought his son to the entrance of a brothel. What could the son do to avoid sinning? I mean, by the way, this is the rabbis at their best. I mean, just the imagery here is just incredible. They're saying that Moshe basically said that God, you forced us to commit adultery, right? That's what it is. We're supposed to have fidelity to God, but you gave us all these riches and left us no choice but to sin, which is what Adam says. So this notion of Adam, this notion of blaming God for our sin because of the good that God did for us starts in the very, very beginning of the Torah and makes its way, at least here, into the story of the golden calf. So this is chutzpah, right, at its highest level. God does great things for us, and we then complain and blame him for our own shortcomings for those sins. Okay, I'm going to stop here and see if there are any comments or questions. I see no one has their hand up in the raised hand. I'll now unmute. Anyone have a comment or a question?
At least in Moshe's defense, doesn't God also kind of play the blame game with him whenever the Jewish people do something wrong? He says something like, your people to Moses.
Yes, they go back and forth with that. That's true. Yep, that's a good point. I don't want them. You take them. It's yours, like your son, like what parents say to each other. Your son did. Yes, excellent. All right, let's continue. The next source is the Ramban. Similar idea from the Ramban. Tam ha'isha asher natati imadi. What does Adam say, the woman that you gave me? Lemor ha'isha asher ata bichvodcha natata otali le'ezer. The woman that you gave me to help me. He natna li min ha'etz. She gave me this fruit from the tree. Vayiti choshev shekol asher tamar elai yeh li le'ezer lehoya. I figured everything that she wanted to do for me was going to be for the good. So this is a little less, right? This takes it down one level. This is not necessarily Adam blaming God, but Adam blaming Chava and explaining why. While the other source was more explicit that Adam was blaming God. And then here we have Rashi. Rashi, what does Rashi call Adam? Kan kafar batova. Adam is an ingrate. Okay, so now, where does Rashi get this from? Rashi is reading the Psukim like we're reading the Psukim, and sounds like that Adam is an ingrate. God gave him Chava, or God gave us all the riches after Yetziat Mitzrayim, and we blame God for our sin. That's a lack of gratitude. But you know who doesn't? So Rashi seems something's wrong with Adam, right? But God does not react in kind, right? And that's sort of the end of our story, right? God does not react in kind. What happens next? God's response. Vayomer Hashem Elohim li'isha mazot asita. Mazot asit. What have you done? And then God tells her that she's going to be punished a little bit for her actions. And Adam is also going to be punished a little bit for his actions. Uladam, right? She's going to have pangs of childbirth, and Adam is going to have to work the ground. The ground is going to be cursed, and it's going to be very hard for him to make the ground yield crops. But what does God not do? Right, I'll unmute. What does God not do?
He didn't take them out of the garden.
He didn't say to Adam, what are you talking about? This isn't my fault. This is your fault. He actually accepts a little bit of Adam's argument. He accepts at least the argument where he blames Chava. He turns right back to Chava, notwithstanding what you said, Yossi, before, that she may not have, your Irv, I think, that she may not have been prohibited from eating from the tree, but the fact that she got him to eat from the tree, that's enough for God to turn to her and say, hey, wait, Adam has a good point here. Now, what God doesn't accept, he doesn't accept Adam's argument that it's his fault with a capital H. But he does accept the argument a little bit that it's not entirely Adam's fault. Because if it was entirely Adam's fault, Chava would not have been punished at all. So even though it's uncomfortable for us to be left with this idea that Chava is punished, at the end of the day, in this first dialogue recorded in the Torah, which is also an argument and a disagreement about justice and about whose fault it is, God, on some level, hears Adam, whatever that means, and accepts part of his argument by putting some of the blame on Chava. Okay, I just want to see one or two more slides from Rav Shurlo, and then we will wrap it up. This is the profound significance of the three elements of the dialogue between man and God. Man is not silent. We said there were three. We didn't review them before. Man is not silent. He speaks to God because God wishes it to be. Man faces God, making claims which he believes are merit and voicing his contentions that he feels are logical. God judges man's arguments and responds to them in different ways. However, God does not promise to accept man's arguments. The gap between man and God remains, and the man-God relationship is destined to remain eternally uneven. Like we said here, God does not fully accept, and Adam is punished. God commands, and man is obligated to obey. The dialogue's significance lies in the fact that within this framework, there is still a great deal of room for man and his arguments. And this is an inseparable part of his definition as one created in God's image, as we said earlier. In Adam's case, his argument is partially accepted. He is not considered solely responsible for eating from the tree of knowledge. Granted, we do not know what the original divine intent was and what would have happened had Adam not defended himself. We may surmise that the original punishment may have been more severe, meaning to just Adam. And that's how Rav Shurlo ends his understanding of this event, that Adam engages in an argument with God. It's not fair that you are upset with me. Either it's your fault or it's Chava's fault, and on some level, God accepts it. And even though God doesn't accept it fully, the key point here is that God doesn't say, what do you know? Like he said to Eov. God doesn't say, you weren't around when the world was created. You're a nobody, I'm God. God does not engage in that at all. He hears Adam out and responds in a way which I think on some level indicates that he partially accepted Adam's argument. Okay, I'll take Emily's comment and then we'll wrap it up. Okay, Emily.
I think it doesn't really matter whether or not Eve was allowed to eat from the tree or not, because regardless of that, she did give him the fruit, and we can surmise that he wouldn't have eaten it if she hadn't given it to him. So she is culpable.
Right. So at the end, she's culpable for something. That's correct. Mm-hmm. Okay. So just to wrap it all up, we see that this notion of arguing with God is widespread. We saw the notion of being created, but Tselem Elokim, in God's image, has at least two ramifications. One ramification of of free will in a way that no other being has, and this other idea that it gives us the opportunity to stand before God as an independent being and make our case. Sometimes God's going to listen, sometimes God's not going to listen. There is a school of thought that says we're never supposed to do that. we're studying a different approach, at least from the perspective of the biblical characters, and we'll bring in other perspectives, other examples of that from non-biblical as well. And the key idea that we're coming away with is that almost all of the time when a biblical character disagrees with God, God does not tell the person to shut up. God does not tell the person to be quiet. He hears that person out, and often, as we see in this case, actually takes into consideration part of the argument and perhaps reframes the way that the punishment is meted out. And that's it for today. Okay, so I want to thank you all for joining. We'll be back here the same time next week, next Monday, and God and Cain, and we'll continue to look at other, like I said, other rabbinic and modern explanations of this as well. Last call for any comments or questions before we go.
It seems like this is the first time of blaming. That somebody tells you, why did you do it? They said, he told me, he said it. This is the first time for a lot of things because the Torah is just getting started. So yeah, this is the first time for a lot of things, but you're right, it's a paradigm. And it's perhaps the Torah telling us that we have, human beings, we have this shortcoming, this inability to take responsibility, where often our first inclination is to try to blame someone else. That's a good point. Okay, everyone. Yesher Koyach. Thank you for coming, for joining.
Thank you.
I hope to see you next week. All the best. Have a good night, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.